there, guys. I'm here again, very gladly, with Professor Bart Kay. This is probably now the 6th time he's been on my channel, which is an absolute delight. Enjoy hearing his ideas about training. I say ideas quite loosely because I find a lot of the time it's facts. So perfect. I'm going to go through some questions that I've had from my subscribers and some that I've had myself. Now, these are all based around training mostly, again, with a few different dietary kind of questions. I'll probably do the simplest one first. So you mentioned insulin secretion from artificial sweeteners being bad, particularly if no glucose is in the system at a given time. So you're having, you know, sucralose, but you're not giving it, you're giving your system glucose that follows it. So why is this the case? Why is this a problem to the human body?
Okay. Everything's relative, and it's the dose that makes the poison. So that's the first caveat. A relatively small amount of something like sucralose, all else being equal, if that's your only sin, probably reasonably innocuous, so long as you're not piling sucralose in left, right, and center because, I don't know, maybe you're addicted to the taste of sweetness or something like that. The issue, as you've outlined there, I think already quite eloquently, Jonathan, is that if you have an insulin response, which is not appropriate for actual carbohydrate entry to the system, that insulin will drag your blood sugar down because there was no carbohydrate to which the body has responded to the taste of sweetness by producing the insulin. There's no carbohydrate to be had. You've fooled your body. So it drags more and more sugar out of your bloodstream, which is going to cause you, more likely than not, to overeat because you're going to be always behind the 8 ball. And that's going to cause a problem in that regard. And over time, if you were pouring in quite a bit of sucralose, you might end up with the kind of issues where you become less sensitive. So those are kind of the potential problems there. As I say, though, a little bit of sucralose, you know, there are worse things you can put into your body. Of all the artificial sweeteners, there are 2 that I'm aware of that are not without problems, but they're the ones that are reasonably innocuous, and they are sucralose and stevia. All the other ones, pretty much, the sugar alcohols, etc., those kind of things, they are all apparently vastly more problematic. And some of them have recently been touted to maybe potentially be associated with cardiac issues. I'm yet to look at that study myself, that everyone's banging on about it on the internet at the moment. But hey, you know, if there's any chance at all that this substance is connected in some causal way to heart disease, that would be a reason to avoid all of those sugar alcohols, pretty much. Purely because it's not necessary in the diet. There's no reason to take that risk, so why would you? All right, that's about it, I think, on that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I thought it was quite a simple question, but it's something that I could see people getting quite wrong. Yeah, so I want to ask some questions about like training for hypertrophy now, because that's what my main focus is nowadays on my channel. So should you lock out when using resistance training for hypertrophy, or does it depend on the movement performed? So if, for example, you're doing a leg extension to work the quadricep muscles, is it more imperative that you lock out in that versus locking out in, say, a squat movement?
If by locking out you mean taking the joint to its full range of motion, then I would suggest that the last thing you should ever do on a leg press machine would be to lock out. You should always stop short of the full locked out knee position. Reason being, because with significant weight on that leg press, your knees can fold backwards and it will tear all your ligaments down the back of your knees, and you'll end up with the tops of your feet up around your chin. Very, very dangerous. never ever lock out on a leg press machine. In terms of a leg extension, that risk doesn't exist because of the way the weight is being applied. Usually it's applied on the front of the shins, just above the feet, on the leg extension machine, for example. And as such, if your muscle fails for any reason, or the knee joint fails for any reason, the only place it's going to go is to bend, not to hyperextend backwards on itself. So that's fine. In a squat, I don't see a massive problem with locking out on a squat. That's the mechanics of that seem to be less likely to cause the problem we're talking about. It really seems to be fairly well isolated to that leg press machine, that 45-degree, your back's on the pad, you've got your feet against the plate, the one that pushes up on a 45, those ones. Many of those machines actually have a top lockout that you can put a pin in that stops you from extending your knees to the lockout position. I would actually never use a leg press that didn't have that. And I would always make sure it's set correctly for my leg length before I start. Because I quite like the ability to walk and to move and to have, functional knee joints. And I'd rather not fold them back 180 degrees on themselves, which also usually ends up sometimes with the bones popping out through the skin. It's not a fun one. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, that seems to make sense, and it matches what we see anecdotally. I mean, I've never seen someone snap their legs or their shins forward doing a squat or a leg extension, but I've seen them do it lots of times with leg press.
Mm.
So it kind of matches that kind of idea of things.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing about training, it's about the time and attention thing again. So I get asked a lot about this at the moment. It's very, people that do the carnivore diet, that follow people like us, they want to maximize what they're doing in the least amount of time. They want to buy it, basically. You mentioned that measuring time under load or time detention is nonsense, or you said something along those lines. So why do you think that? And do you think there's an optimal time detention for muscular hypertrophy? Is it that you just need to provide that stimulants under a given load safely? Or is it that you need to perform a certain amount to produce metabolic build-up materials?
Yeah. Okay, so there are a number of different commentators in the literature publishing different studies suggesting different things in this regard. And it's one of those situations where there is a possibility that there are more than one ways to skin a cat. So there is this divergence where there are those who say that training volume is the important factor for physical training of any kind, including hypertrophy. And there are those who say, no, in terms of fitness capacities of all kinds, including hypertrophy, the important stimulus factor is the resistance, the absolute intensity, and not so much the volume. And by volume, I mean both numbers of repetitions and sets, as well as time under tension, because they are all volume-related indices. Whereas intensity is controlled primarily by how much weight are you moving with that muscle group for that particular exercise. From my reading of the literature over the last 25 years or so, and from my own experience as a hypertrophy athlete 30 years ago, 30 years ago, Jesus, incredible. Anyway, what I found is, this is my experience. This is what I tell people. This works. That's why I tell people this. The truth is somewhere in the middle of those two hard extremes on that divergence. You need to have an amount of volume, but more is not better. There is an optimal amount of volume. And volume, I mean numbers of exercises for a given muscle group, number of sets for that muscle group, number of reps per set, and time under tension. They're the things that all mesh together to produce what we would call volume. And intensity is how much weight are you lifting. So for me, what's important here is that when we think about exercise training, we think about it in terms that a pharmacist might think about prescription drugs. A pharmacist is trained to think this way. What is the lowest possible dose of this substance we can give somebody and get the response that we expect to get in most people under most circumstances? It's least effective exposure, not how much of the stuff can we give somebody. All right. People who advise athletes, be they professional, sub-professional, or even weekend warriors, those people tend to have the exact opposite attitude, and that is that more volume is better than less, and even more volume is even better than that. Now, if you give someone more and more and more volume, necessarily, as a physiological fact, that means the intensity has to be compromised. Okay, if I ask you to do 5 sets of 15 reps for any given muscle group, there is no way you can lift as much weight for 5 sets, 15 reps as you could if I told you to do 2 sets of 8 reps that will allow you to lift more absolute weight. And as such, the balance between intensity and volume is optimized. What I have found the optimal balance between intensity and volume in hypertrophy training, personally, with not just myself, but with hundreds of people I've worked with over years, I have found that 2 working sets, not 3 or 4 or 5, 2 working sets of 8 repetitions, not 9 or 10 or 15, 8, and exactly 8, if you possibly can, that seems to be the optimum. 2 sets of 8 for a muscle group per day. And train that muscle group not more than 3 times a week, doing a whole body split. The only people that need to split, in my opinion, are people who are advanced bodybuilders with a lot of muscle mass that they need to maintain and develop. They're doing a higher volume of training and they need to split. Everybody else can do a whole body split. 2 sets of 8, done and dusted, whole body, 45 minutes to an hour, 3 times a week, and you're out of the gym. Minimum effective exposure. Now, when I say 8 reps, what that means is the resistance for any given exercise is such that if you attempted a 9th lift on any given set, you will fail. It needs to be heavy enough to achieve that. If you can lift it 9 times, the next time you do that exercise, you must increase that weight by 5%. And if you can still lift it 9 times, you must do the same again, increase it by another 5%. Until you fail on the 9th. That is how you set your intensity and keep it there. And you need to keep a check on that. So always attempt the 9th is what I'm saying. And if you can do it, next time it goes up. That's basically how you keep your intensity where it needs to be. Never increase your volume. Increasing your volume above 2 sets of 8 for hypertrophy specifically, no good, no value. So there's that part. Time under tension is a sort of separate variable that plays into volume as well. And for those who don't know, what it means is how long are you taking to do a lift? What is the cadence of the lift? And some people talk about counting and all of this kind of stuff. I'm not a fan of counting personally, 1, 2, 3 up, 1, 2, 3 down, or something like that, whatever it is, because the concentric phase of a lift ought to be explosive and it ought to be completed as rapidly, as explosively as you can possibly lift that weight. So that should be, I mean, with a very heavy weight, that's still going to be, there'll be some time involved. You're not just going to blast that weight up. It will resist you, obviously, that's what weight is, and that will slow it down. But the intent in your mind should be to lift that weight quickly to the top of the concentric phase. Then for the eccentric phase, lowering the weight back to the starting point, you do that as slowly as you can achieve that while keeping good form. So the set takes a while. Bam, up fast. Slowly, 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 slowly back down. Bam, back up fast again. That's your time under tension. That's the optimal for basically ripping your muscles up. That's the thing that will cause the maximum delayed onset muscle soreness the next day, if you're going to get any, because once you're an advanced lifter, you probably won't even notice it. But it's that physical damage, it's that micro tearing of your muscle fibers that generally is thought to be one of the very important factors for hypertrophy training. So that's how I teach it. That's what I suggest is the best approach. It's not the only way to achieve hypertrophy. There are other ways of doing it, but most of the other methods I've ever heard of involve vastly more volume, compromised intensity, much more time input, much more effort input, much more likelihood of injury. I'm not a fan of any of the other methods. And if you want to follow somebody else's teachings, absolutely, it's your funeral. You do that, but that's what my teaching is. There you go.
Despite your caveat there, Bart, you've just managed to achieve me for about 100 dislikes for this video already.
Uh-huh.
Disagrees with their ideology.
Yeah, well.
Never mind that. But yeah, I kind of think the same thing. I think that as soon as we start adding volume for the sake of adding volume, we take away that illicit specific intensity that we need to stimulate the adaptation process. Also, it means the margin for error and the margin of difficulty it is to recover can become so great. Because if you're just saying, right, keep it simple, do 2 sets as hard as you can for a given body, do it, 3 times a week, whatever.
Yeah.
That means that is your standard. Then all you're increasing basically is the intensity side of it by making the weight heavier, which if you're training properly, recovering properly, that will get heavier.
Yes.
Now, how would that interplay with someone that's more advanced then? I mean, of course, you'll do a more split up training sort of system. You might add in some intensifiers, but would it get to a point where you're sort of, say, my sort of experience level, you're always adding intensifiers, or would you still focus as the weight lifted with good form being the mainstay of the program?
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan that all resistance training exercises ought to be undertaken with strict adherence to correct form. And if that means it compromises the absolute load, I would sooner see a person complete the lift correctly. Because if you're going to get injured, it's because your form is off 9 times out of 10, if not more than that. Or you're going to do something stupid, like try and lift too much weight, or try and do something without a spotter that you shouldn't do without a spotter, or, something like that. So 9 out of 10 injuries are going to be poor form related. So I would always focus on that. Quite right about splitting up and intensifiers and stuff. That really, for me, is probably once you've been lifting for a year or more, and you probably by that stage have maybe 10 kilos of extra muscle mass on you above your baseline genetic. If you weren't lifting for 3 or 4 years, what would you return to sort of physique? Prior to that, it's just really not indicated. You can do a whole body split, 10 or 12 exercises, head to toe, 2 sets of each, which, by the way, I always superset. You don't do 1 set, rest, your second set, move to the next exercise. You go through all your 10 to 12 exercises back to the top and do your second set. No sitting on the bench in between sets. No sipping on water as if you need to be doing that. No looking around to see who looks banging in their lycra. You're there for a specific purpose. Get it done and get the hell out of there. 45 minutes to an hour.
So I'm guessing by the sound of it, it's almost like a giant set where you've got a circuit. Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah.
So
as much as you can.
Is that for a fitness benefit, or is it just to allow your muscles that you recruited in a given set a chance to recuperate for the next round?
Yeah, I'd like to see someone's second set to be as useful as the first one, because if I say to you, keep your intensity up so that you're going to fail on the 9th rep, if you're going to do 2 sets of that, it's going to be 5, 6, 7 minutes in between sets before you could actually lift that same weight 8 times again. So there's 2 ways of doing that. Sit on a bench for 5 or 6 minutes, cooling down, sipping on water, looking at who looks banging in their lycra, or get on with your program, move on to the next exercise, and come back to doing your second set probably 20, 25 minutes later.
Okay.
I just find that to be vastly more effective. Plus, obviously, the fitness benefit of not sitting around for more than half the time you're in the gym. And as a function of that, to do the same number of lifts, you're probably sitting in that gym for twice as much time. And time is money at the end of the day.
That sounds about right. I mean, if you're doing a full body workout and you're resting between, it's going to take you much longer than 45 minutes to complete. But when you're doing it, as you mentioned, in a giant set with 2 repetitions, basically, to repeat the set twice, it's going to be more time effective.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a minimum exposure to the exercise, and also to time that you have to invest on being in that place when you're not doing other things. Because most of us have got jobs to do, money to earn, kids to see to, etc. So, yeah.
That's cool stuff. But I've got a question now on the 4, well, technically 5 biohacks that you've got. So you've got the diet itself, you've got the cerebral bugs, you've got the grounding, you've got the light exposure, and I believe you've got the training now. So I don't really need you to go through all of them and explain all the mechanisms around that, because it'll be probably about an hour probably. But can you kind of explain, what's your rationale for having, say, the diet first and the training last? Or I don't have any particular bias. I'm asking you from the position that I'm interested why you think it's this way.
Yeah. Okay. The listing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order of priority is, in my mind, based on my understandings of what I believe the relative importances of those things to be, in terms of their likelihood to affect the overall goodness of one's experience of the universe if you were to fail to apply the others, for example. That doesn't mean I think you should fail to apply any one of those 5 things. I think every single person should apply all 5, thus to maximize your chances of having the best possible experience of life, the universe, and everything that's possible. So I guess I've put training at number 5, because if you train and do your training effectively and correctly, but your diet is poor, you don't take cerebral products, you're not electrically grounding, you're not worried about blue light because you think that's woo-woo, that training by itself will have an impact. Absolutely, of course it will. But will you be optimized? I don't think anywhere near where you could be. And I think as an exercise physiologist, first and foremost, before I was a nutritionist and before I was a cardiovascular pathophysiologist and a statistician and all of that, my first advanced research degree is in exercise physiology. So as such, I do have some expertise in that field specifically. And it is my belief that the best analogy for that is what a lot of people throw around, and it's absolutely correct, and that is this: you cannot outrun a bad diet. There is no form of training that will absolve you from eating poorly. You will suffer the consequences. Therefore, diet has to come before exercise. And then we could go through the rationale for each of the other interventions as well, but it's all, I mean, what I did is I got out a whiteboard and a pen, and I split the board up, and I went, right, what goes ahead of what, how am I going to order these 5 things? And that's what I came up with. So diet first, cereal second, grounding third, blue light fourth, exercise fifth. They're my top 5 interventions lifestyle-wise, in that order of preference. People, of course, are free to experiment with those things and put them in any order they like, but there are consequences.
Yeah, what I'll do below this video, just so people can look into that further, is I'll add in Bart's YouTube channel, of course, his YouTube video on the health hacks, the link to buy cereal products, things like that.
Awesome.
I'll probably ask more questions about that next time we've got a bit more time. But that's pretty much everything for today, I think. Very succinct, very good answers, and I actually understood all of it. So brilliant.
There you go. My pleasure, Jonathan.
Reckon.
All
right, so I'll wrap this up now. Thank you very much for coming on my channel again for the 6th time. Look forward to doing more of these and hopefully answering some more sensible questions.
Yes, and we'll see you not this weekend, but next if you're free for the live stream. That would be assuming that YouTube allows us to have one.
Fingers crossed.
Jesus.
All
right, see you then.